Michael Patterson, a 67-year-old Vietnam veteran and retired aircraft mechanic, thought his biggest worry was keeping his late wife's garden alive through another scorching Texas summer. Then Kevin Mitchell knocked on his door at 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, demanding he remove the small POW, MIA flag hanging beneath his American flag. What happened next will make you question everything you know about honor, hypocrisy, and the price of standing up for what's right in your own neighborhood. Before you hear this story, ask yourself, do you really know what flags your HOA allows? This happened just 8 months ago in Maple Ridge Estates, a quiet subdivision outside Austin. The veteran involved, he's still fighting, and what he discovered about his HOA board will shock you. This story will change how you look at every flag in your neighborhood, and every person who claims to represent your community's values. Mike Patterson had lived at 1247 Oakwood Drive for 23 years, moving there with his wife Linda after he retired from the airlines where he'd maintained commercial aircraft for 3 decades. The house represented everything they'd worked for, a modest 2-story colonial with Linda's prized rose garden out front and a small flagpole where Mike flew his American flag every single day. It wasn't about politics or making statements. For Mike, that flag represented the brothers he'd left in Vietnam, the promises America had made to families like his, and the quiet dignity of service that had shaped his entire adult life. Linda had passed 2 years earlier after a brief battle with cancer, leaving Mike alone in their dream home with his 89-year-old mother Dorothy, who'd moved in after Linda's diagnosis. Dorothy Patterson was a Gold Star mother who'd lost her younger son Tommy in Vietnam just 6 months before Mike returned home. The flag meant something different to her. It was Tommy's memory flying in the Texas wind, a daily reminder that some sacrifices should never be forgotten. 6 months ago, Mike had added something new beneath his American flag, a small 3x5 POW MIA banner, with the haunting black silhouette and words "You are not forgotten." He'd bought it at the VFW post, after attending a ceremony honoring recently identified remains returned from Southeast Asia. One of those remains belonged to his squad leader from 1969, a man who'd saved Mike's life during the Tet Offensive. Flying that flag felt like keeping a promise to Sergeant Martinez and the 60,000 Americans still unaccounted for from that war. The flag had hung peacefully for months. Neighbors occasionally nodded approvingly when they walked by. Mrs. Chen from across the street had even asked Mike about its meaning, thanking him afterward for helping her understand why her own father, a Korean War veteran, had always stood so straight during the national anthem. Mike thought he was honoring his community's values, not violating them. Kevin Mitchell had different ideas. Kevin served as the HOA board's enforcement officer, a position he'd held for 4 years and wielded like a medieval sword. At 45, Kevin worked as an insurance adjuster, spending his days finding reasons to deny claims and his evenings finding violations in his neighbors' yards. He lived 3 streets over in a larger house with his wife and teenage son, flying his own flag every day. A Confederate battle flag mounted prominently on his garage, visible from the main neighborhood entrance. Kevin's sister-in-law Patricia served as the HOA secretary, making their family a powerful block on the 5-member board. Patricia, 42 and unmarried, had worked as a DMV clerk for 20 years, perfecting the art of bureaucratic intimidation. Together, Kevin and Patricia had transformed the Maple Ridge HOA from a neighborly organization into something resembling a small-town dictatorship, where rules applied differently depending on who you knew and how much trouble you might cause. That Tuesday morning in March, Kevin stood on Mike's front porch holding a clipboard and wearing the smug expression of someone who'd found the perfect excuse to flex his authority. Mike opened the door expecting a neighbor needing to borrow tools or maybe someone collecting for charity. Instead, he found Kevin pointing at his flagpole with unconcealed satisfaction. The violation notice Kevin handed Mike cited Section 4.7 of the HOA Covenants. No flags other than approved United States flags may be displayed on residential properties. The fine was $50, with additional $50 penalties for each day the violation continued. Kevin explained that multiple neighbors had complained about Mike's inappropriate display and demanded immediate compliance. Mike read the notice twice, confusion replacing his initial annoyance. He'd lived in Maple Ridge longer than Kevin had been on the board. He'd never heard of flag restrictions beyond basic size and placement guidelines. More importantly, he walked past Kevin's Confederate flag every time he drove to the grocery store. If the HOA was suddenly enforcing flag rules, why wasn't Kevin finding himself? When Mike asked this question, Kevin's demeanor shifted from official to personal. He explained that his flag was historical and educational, protected under different guidelines. The POW flag, however, was political and divisive, making neighbors uncomfortable. Kevin suggested Mike could display his veteran status in other ways, perhaps a small decal in his window or a bumper sticker on his car, but the flag had to come down immediately. Mike felt something cold settle in his stomach as Kevin walked away. This wasn't about neighborhood aesthetics or property values. This was about power, selective enforcement, and the kind of petty tyranny that thrived in HOA boardrooms across America. But Mike had learned something important in Vietnam. Sometimes the most dangerous fights started with the smallest provocations. That evening, Mike called his neighbor Jimmy Rodriguez, a 38-year-old Iraq War veteran who lived 2 blocks away. Jimmy worked in IT for a local hospital and had the kind of technical skills that older veterans like Mike respected but didn't fully understand. More importantly, Jimmy had the same look in his eyes that Mike remembered from his own military service, the quiet competence of someone who'd been tested under fire and emerged stronger. Jimmy listened to Mike's story with growing anger, not just at the selective enforcement but at the deeper implications. Jimmy had noticed Kevin's Confederate flag during his daily runs and wondered how it complied with any reasonable community standards. The fact that Kevin was targeting a POW flag while protecting his own controversial display revealed something ugly about the power dynamics in their neighborhood. Together, Mike and Jimmy began researching the HOA's actual rules and enforcement history. What they discovered was a pattern of selective application that would have impressed a corrupt small-town sheriff. Kevin had filed dozens of violations over the past 4 years, targeting residents who'd crossed him personally while ignoring identical violations by his friends and family members. Patricia had processed every one of Kevin's complaints without question, while mysteriously losing paperwork for complaints filed against board members. The flag restriction that Kevin had cited was real, but it had never been consistently enforced. Several residents displayed decorative flags for holidays, seasons, and sports teams without receiving violations. More damning, the board had never voted to designate certain flags as historical or educational. Kevin had simply made that determination himself when it suited his purposes. Jimmy's technical background proved invaluable as they documented the discrimination. He photographed every flag in the neighborhood, created spreadsheets showing enforcement patterns, and researched the legal precedents surrounding flag displays in residential communities. What emerged was a clear picture of an HOA board using selective enforcement to settle personal grudges while protecting their own rule violations. Meanwhile, the daily stress was taking its toll on Mike's elderly mother, Dorothy. She'd lived through enough discrimination in her 89 years to recognize it when she saw it, and watching her surviving son being targeted for honoring his fallen brother brought back painful memories of the hostility Vietnam veterans had faced when they returned home. Dorothy had spent 54 years carrying the grief of losing Tommy, and now she was watching Mike being punished for refusing to forget him. The situation escalated when Mike refused to pay the accumulating fines or remove his flag. Kevin responded by scheduling a special board meeting to discuss chronic covenant violations and residents who refused to respect community standards. The meeting notice, sent to all homeowners, specifically mentioned Mike's address and described his POW flag as a non-compliant political display that has generated numerous neighbor complaints. Mike had never spoken at an HOA meeting before, preferring to handle his business quietly and leave community politics to others. But Kevin's public humiliation tactics crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. With Jimmy's encouragement and Dorothy's fierce blessing, Mike decided to attend the meeting and defend not just his flag, but the principles it represented. The night before the meeting, Jimmy helped Mike prepare by researching Texas state laws regarding flag displays and HOA authority. They discovered that Texas had specific protections for American flags and military honor flags, potentially limiting the HOA's ability to restrict patriotic displays. More importantly, they found precedents showing that selective enforcement could invalidate HOA rules entirely, especially when the selectivity revealed discriminatory intent. Jimmy also reached out to other veterans in the neighborhood, men and women who'd served in conflicts from Korea to Afghanistan. What he found was a community within a community, dozens of military families, who'd been quietly watching Kevin's behavior with growing concern. Many had their own stories of HOA harassment, but none had felt strong enough to fight back alone. Mike's stand was giving them permission to speak up together. Walter Henderson, a 74-year-old Korean War veteran who lived on Maple Street, became Mike's most important ally. Walter had commanded respect in Maple Ridge for decades, serving as an informal community elder and mediator for neighborhood disputes. His support carried weight with residents who might otherwise stay neutral in an HOA fight. More importantly, Walter understood the generational significance of Mike's battle. This wasn't just about one flag or one veteran, but about whether military service still meant something in American communities. The special board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the community center, a modest building that usually hosted children's birthday parties and book clubs. By 7 p.m., the parking lot was packed with more cars than the center had seen since its dedication ceremony 15 years earlier. Mike arrived with Jimmy, Dorothy, and Walter, surprised by the crowd, but determined to make his case regardless of the audience size. Kevin had clearly expected a quick, one-sided proceeding where the board would ratify his enforcement actions and maybe scold Mike for wasting everyone's time. Instead, he found himself facing a room full of neighbors, many wearing military pins, veteran caps, or patriotic clothing. The atmosphere wasn't hostile, but it carried the weight of serious attention. People had come to witness something important. Patricia called the meeting to order and immediately tried to control the narrative by reading Kevin's violation report, emphasizing the multiple complaints about Mike's flag and the community disruption caused by his refusal to comply with established guidelines. She presented the board's position as reasonable and necessary, painting Mike as a stubborn resident who thought rules didn't apply to him. When Mike was finally allowed to speak, he stood slowly, using the cane he'd needed since his helicopter crash in Vietnam had left him with a permanent limp. The room fell silent as he looked around at his neighbors, some of whom he'd known for decades but had never really talked to about his military service. Mike had never been comfortable being the center of attention, but he found his voice by focusing on the simple truth he'd come to share. Mike began by thanking the board for their service to the community, acknowledging that volunteer leadership was often thankless work. But then he explained what the POW MIA flag meant to him, to his mother, and to the families of the men and women who'd never made it home. He talked about Sergeant Martinez, about promises made and kept, about the difference between honoring sacrifice and making political statements. His voice stayed steady as he described walking past Kevin's Confederate flag every week, wondering why one symbol of the past deserved protection, while another deserved persecution. The power in Mike's words wasn't in their eloquence. He spoke simply, without rhetorical flourish or practiced delivery. The power came from their authenticity, from the visible cost of standing up when standing was difficult, from the quiet dignity of someone defending principles rather than personal interests. When Mike finished speaking, the silence in the room carried a weight that made Kevin's bureaucratic citation seem petty and small. Jimmy spoke next, presenting the documentation he'd compiled showing selective enforcement patterns and questioning the board's legal authority to restrict military honor flags under Texas state law. Walter followed, sharing his perspective as a Korean War veteran and longtime community member, expressing disappointment that Maple Ridge had reached a point where military service needed to be defended from its own leadership. But the evening's most powerful moment came when Dorothy Patterson asked to address the board. At 89, walking required assistance, and speaking in public exhausted her limited energy. But Dorothy had something to say that she'd been carrying for 54 years, and Kevin's persecution of her surviving son had finally given her the platform to say it. Dorothy spoke about receiving the telegram about Tommy's death in 1970, about the flag that came home instead of her 19-year-old son, about the promises the government had made to families like hers about never forgetting the sacrifice. She talked about watching Mike struggle with his own demons after returning from the same war that took his brother, about the healing power of honoring rather than hiding military service. Most powerfully, she asked the board members to imagine explaining to their own grandchildren why flying a flag to remember missing soldiers was against community rules, while flying a flag that represented rebellion against the United States was perfectly acceptable. The board members' responses revealed the fundamental weakness of their position. Kevin tried to maintain that flag restrictions applied equally to everyone, but couldn't explain why his own display had never received scrutiny. Patricia emphasized procedural compliance and neighbor complaints, but couldn't produce any of the actual complaints she'd referenced. The other board members, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, asked questions that suggested they'd been kept out of Kevin's enforcement decisions. The meeting's turning point came when Rebecca Chen, a reporter for the local newspaper, asked to address the board. Rebecca had been attending as a resident rather than a journalist, but the evening's events had convinced her that the community deserved to know about the selective enforcement patterns Jimmy had documented. Her questions were professional but pointed, asking for specific responses to the discrimination allegations and requesting copies of all flag-related enforcement actions for the past 5 years. Kevin's reaction to media scrutiny revealed his true character. Instead of addressing the substantive questions, he became defensive and angry, accusing Rebecca of ambushing the board and threatening to have her removed from the meeting. His loss of composure contrasted sharply with Mike's quiet dignity, making the power dynamics in the room suddenly visible to everyone present. The meeting ended without resolution, but the momentum had clearly shifted. Kevin had expected to intimidate one stubborn veteran into compliance. Instead, he'd revealed his discriminatory enforcement patterns to a room full of neighbors and a journalist, while failing to justify his authority to restrict military honor flags. Mike had come seeking fairness and left with something more valuable: community support and media attention. The next morning, Rebecca's article appeared on the newspaper's front page under the headline, "Local HOA Targets Veterans POW MIA Flag While Protecting Confederate Display." The story included Jimmy's enforcement data, quotes from the meeting, and photographs of both Mike's and Kevin's flags. More importantly, it placed the Maple Ridge dispute in the broader context of HOA overreach and discriminatory enforcement patterns that were affecting communities across Texas and beyond. The article's publication transformed a neighborhood dispute into a regional story that resonated with military families, veterans organizations, and anyone who'd experienced HOA harassment. Mike's phone began ringing with calls from reporters, veteran advocates, and complete strangers offering support. The VFW Post, where he'd bought the POW MIA flag, invited him to speak at their next meeting. Local TV stations requested interviews. But the most meaningful response came from within Maple Ridge itself, as neighbors who had been quietly uncomfortable with Kevin's leadership found the courage to speak up. A petition supporting Mike's right to display military honor flags gathered over 200 signatures in 3 days. Residents began sharing their own stories of selective enforcement, revealing a pattern of intimidation that extended far beyond flag displays. Kevin's response to the negative publicity revealed the depth of his narcissistic investment in his HOA authority. Instead of acknowledging the discrimination or seeking compromise, he doubled down on his enforcement actions, issuing additional violations for creating community disruption and failure to comply with board directives. He scheduled another board meeting to discuss Mike's ongoing defiance and proposed increasing the daily fines to $100. This escalation proved to be Kevin's crucial mistake, because it attracted the attention of David Park, a constitutional attorney who specialized in civil rights cases and had particular expertise in HOA law. David had served as an Army JAG officer before entering private practice, giving him both the legal background and personal motivation to take on discrimination cases involving veterans. And when he read about Mike's situation, he offered his services pro bono. David's involvement changed the entire dynamic of the dispute. His initial letter to the board outlined the federal and state law violations inherent in selective enforcement targeting military displays, while referencing specific court precedents that had resulted in significant financial judgments against discriminatory HOAs. More importantly, David's letter made it clear that Mike now had professional, legal representation prepared to take the case to federal court if necessary. The legal pressure combined with media attention and community support created an impossible situation for Kevin and Patricia. Their authority depended on residents' reluctance to challenge HOA decisions, but Mike's case had demonstrated that organized resistance could expose and defeat discriminatory enforcement. Other residents began questioning HOA actions they'd previously accepted, requesting documentation and challenging selective applications of community rules. The board's next meeting drew an even larger crowd, including representatives from 3 veterans organizations, local politicians, and reporters from multiple media outlets. Kevin found himself defending not just his flag enforcement, but his entire approach to HOA leadership, with his past actions now subject to public scrutiny and legal challenge. Under pressure from the community, media, and legal threats, the other board members began distancing themselves from Kevin's position. They'd been content to let him handle enforcement as long as it didn't create problems for them, but his selective targeting of a Vietnam veteran had become a public relations nightmare that threatened their own standing in the community. The resolution came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the steady pressure of accountability. Faced with the possibility of expensive litigation, negative media coverage, and potential personal liability for discriminatory actions, the board voted to suspend all flag-related enforcement pending a complete review of community guidelines. Kevin abstained from the vote, while Patricia reluctantly supported the suspension after David's presentation of the legal risks they faced. More significantly, the board voted to establish new procedures for enforcement actions, requiring documentation of complaints, equal application of rules, and community input on policy changes. Kevin's unilateral authority to issue violations was eliminated, replaced by a system that provided due process and prevented selective targeting of individual residents. Kevin's response to losing his enforcement authority revealed the personal motivations that had driven his persecution of Mike. In a heated exchange with board members, he accused them of caving to political correctness and betraying their duty to maintain community standards. His inability to distinguish between consistent rule enforcement and discriminatory targeting made it clear that his actions had been personal from the beginning. The aftermath of Mike's victory extended far beyond his individual case. The precedent established in Maple Ridge inspired veterans in other communities to challenge discriminatory HOA actions, creating a network of mutual support that made future targeting more difficult. The media attention educated homeowners about their rights regarding military displays, while highlighting the potential for HOA abuse when oversight is lacking. For Mike personally, the experience had been transformative in ways he hadn't expected. The quiet veteran who'd preferred to avoid confrontation had discovered his capacity for leadership and advocacy. The community that had seemed indifferent to his values had revealed deep wells of support for principles he'd thought were disappearing from American life. Most importantly, the flag that had started as a personal memorial had become a symbol of resistance to the kind of petty tyranny that threatens community values. Dorothy Patterson lived to see her son vindicated and his principles validated by his neighbors. The stress of the fight had exhausted her limited energy, but the victory had provided something more valuable: confirmation that Tommy's sacrifice and Mike's service still mattered to their community. She passed away peacefully 4 months later, with Mike's POW Mia flag visible from her bedroom window, flying proudly alongside the American flag that represented everything she'd believed in. Kevin Mitchell resigned from the HOA board 3 months after the flag dispute was resolved. Unable to function effectively without his enforcement authority, he and his family moved out of Maple Ridge the following year, selling their house to a young military family whose first act was to remove the Confederate flag from the garage and replace it with a simple American flag display that complied with the community's newly clarified guidelines. Patricia remained as HOA secretary, but under significant constraints that prevented future abuse of her administrative authority. The new enforcement procedures required her to document all complaints, provide equal treatment, regardless of personal relationships, and submit regular reports to the full board. Her bureaucratic power had been neutralized by transparency and accountability. The Maple Ridge HOA became a model for other communities seeking to balance property standards with individual rights, particularly regarding military displays and veteran recognition. Their revised guidelines explicitly protected American flags, military honor flags, and service member displays while maintaining reasonable restrictions on commercial and purely political messaging. Mike Patterson continues to live at 1247 Oakwood Drive, tending Linda's Rose Garden and flying his flags with quiet pride. The POW Maya banner beneath his American flag has faded slightly from 2 years of Texas sun and wind, but its message remains clear to everyone who passes by. Some promises should never be broken. Some sacrifices should never be forgotten, and some principles are worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. The small flagpole in Mike's front yard has become an informal memorial site where neighbors occasionally leave flowers on military holidays and veterans stop to pay their respects during morning walks. Children in the neighborhood have learned to pause when the flags are lowered to half-staff, understanding that the man who lives behind the roses takes certain things seriously and expects them to do the same. Jimmy Rodriguez remained Mike's closest friend and ally, their bond forged in the crucible of fighting for principles that transcended personal interest. Their friendship bridges generational differences between Vietnam and Iraq veterans, creating understanding between military experiences separated by decades. but united by shared values of service and sacrifice. Walter Henderson's support during Mike's fight elevated his status as a community elder, making him the informal arbiter of disputes that might otherwise escalate to HOA intervention. His voice carries moral authority that prevents the kind of petty conflicts that Kevin had exploited for personal power, creating a neighborhood culture based on mutual respect rather than regulatory intimidation. The broader impact of Mike's stand against discriminatory enforcement continues to resonate in military communities across Texas and beyond. Veterans organizations cite the Maple Ridge case as an example of effective resistance to HOA overreach, while legal advocates use David Park's documentation of selective enforcement patterns to support similar cases in other jurisdictions. Mike's story demonstrates that individual courage can challenge institutional abuse when supported by community values and legal principle. His reluctant transformation from private citizen to public advocate illustrates the potential for ordinary people to defend extraordinary principles when those principles are threatened by petty tyranny disguised as bureaucratic authority. The flags still fly at 1247 Oakwood Drive, visible reminders that some battles are worth fighting, some sacrifices deserve remembrance, and some communities can find the courage to stand up for what's right when tested by those who abuse the power they've been given to serve others. Mike Patterson thought his biggest worry was keeping his late wife's garden alive. Instead, he discovered that his neighborhood's values were very much alive, waiting for someone brave enough to defend them against those who would corrupt them for personal gain. In the end, Kevin Mitchell's attempt to use HOA authority to silence military remembrance had the opposite effect, creating a community more aware of veterans' contributions, more protective of individual rights, and more vigilant against the selective enforcement that enables discrimination to flourish in the shadows of bureaucratic indifference. The POW Maya flag that Kevin tried to remove became a symbol of resistance that inspired similar displays throughout Maple Ridge and beyond, ensuring that the promise to never forget would be kept by an entire community rather than one aging veteran standing alone against institutional hostility. The lesson of Maple Ridge echoes in every HOA dispute, where personal power masquerades as community service, when individuals find the courage to stand up for principle, when neighbors choose support over silence, and when communities demand accountability from their leadership. Even the most entrenched abuse of authority can be defeated by the simple power of people who refuse to be intimidated by those who mistake position for legitimacy. Mike Patterson's flag still flies, and the wind that moves it carries more than fabric and memory. It carries the proof that ordinary courage can achieve extraordinary justice when ordinary people decide that some things are worth defending, regardless of the cost, regardless of the opposition, and regardless of the easier path of looking away and hoping someone else will take the stand that conscience demands.